Okay, so we're continuing with fiscal policy. We've talked about tax, so obviously we need to talk about government spending. There's three categories of government spending. You can have transfer payments. Here we see the transfer payments, and these are non-exhaustive government spending, which means the government doesn't actually spend it. It gives the money to the citizens for them to spend it. So it could be unemployment benefits, state pension, interest on payments for national debt, etc. So that's part of government spending. Then you've got current spending, which is exhaustive government spending, because the government actually spends the money, and this can be on goods and services which are used for state finance services, like education, police, whatever. So these goods and services is something they consume, like petrol or wages. Because the next category is capital spending, which is also exhaustive government spending, and that's on infrastructure. So they don't consume it, they use it, and it's an investment. Now, I've put on the PowerPoint the two categories of exhaustive government spending and non-exhaustive government spending, because they're very important. Just to remember, it's exhaustive government spending is that where the government spends the money. Non-exhaustive government spending is just a payment made to citizens to spend in the way they like. So they don't know how the resources will be used. Reasons for government spending. So the one reason could be to influence aggregate demands. That would be, of course, fiscal policy. So if they want aggregate demand to increase the economic activity and possible jobs, they could spend a lot of money. Obviously that depends if the economy is on the full capacity or not, or if it's on full capacity, they want to slow inflation, they can reduce aggregate demand by reducing spending. So, or it could be to increase aggregate supply. Maybe they spend on, I don't know, subsidies for solar panels, or maybe for robots, a grant for a big company for robots to try to increase production. And so aggregate supply will go up, maybe training or education. They could spend money to reduce inequality. A lot of money spent by the government is to redistribute the income. Maybe if they want to reduce inequality a lot, they could be building houses, so they've got more popular housing, maybe increase unemployment benefits or low pensions or something like that. To overcome market failure. So we know merit goods, goods which are underprovided by the market, they need government spending, because we know the market fails because the economic use of resources is to provide more of these than the market normally provides. Normally the market for education and health will not provide much for the poor, whereas it's a very good economic use of resources to educate people and to keep them healthy. So to overcome this market failure, and public goods where you've got free riders, like with the public lighting, that's a good reason for government spending. We need public goods. Maybe the government wants to win political popularity before an election, or some sort of challenge electoral challenge of the governments, they may decide to spend a lot of money to put people's wages up, public sector workers' wages up, or maybe just cut the grass and make the city look very presentable. Or another reason could be due to lobbying. Lots of industries lobby the government. That means they try to convince the government to spend in a certain way which would be good for their specific economic activity. I don't know, maybe road builders try to convince the government to upgrade their roads, for example. Now, you can have two types of fiscal policy. You've got expansionary fiscal policy or contractionary fiscal policy. Expansionary fiscal policy increases the government's spending and or reduces taxation, and so this should increase aggregate demand and increase economic activity. So you'll end up increasing jobs, etc. Obviously, for this, you're aiming for a budget deficit. Alternatively, a contractionary fiscal policy would be where the government decreases government spending and or increases taxation to reduce aggregate demand. So maybe they're worried about inflation and they decide to reduce economic the economic speed, the economic activity, and so here they will be aiming for a budget surplus. We call the intended policy, fiscal policy of the government, whether it's surplus or deficit, a discretionary government policy, because actually the reality may not always be what they wanted. If they wanted a surplus in the budget and they wanted a contractionary policy, maybe people did pay more taxes because of the higher GDP or something, because there's more GDP for some reason, I don't know, better educated workforce, more immigrants, whatever. And so it doesn't always happen what they intended. So the discretionary government policy is when the government intends to aim for a surplus or deficit, but the reality doesn't mean they necessarily get it when it's analysed at the end of the year. So the government can opt just to allow automatic stabilisers influence aggregate demand. So for example, if we're going through a crisis and unemployment's going up, they may pay unemployment benefits automatically, and obviously those unemployed will be paying no tax. So there might be these automatic stabilisers which create a fiscal expansion anyway, without even the government having a discretionary policy, economic policy, to try to have this budget deficit. Now, one thing we need to talk about also is the impact of fiscal policy, because not always the intention of the fiscal policy happens. If we do have an expansionary fiscal policy, it doesn't necessarily mean that aggregate demand will go up, because some people may save, they may decide to save. A lot of it goes on psychology. If they're very pessimistic, people will decide to put money away rather than spend, and so leave aggregate demand untouched. So it's not always predictable. Another example is in a contractionary fiscal policy to resolve demand pull inflation. Maybe they reduce taxation, but people start looking for higher wages, and that in itself can push up inflation. You've got cost push inflation. So it all goes on the behaviour of the citizens. So we've got these economic logics and models and rationales, but in reality, it's not always predictable.